Who owns the air? This, of course, is not a new question, but as you can imagine, it's a key one, particularly in aviation. Can airplanes travel freely from one continent to another without asking any questions? How about from one city to the next? Or can you cross entire oceans without asking for permission down below? Well, the fact is that flying through the sky is not as free as you would imagine. The air has owners, many owners indeed. How this came to happen is a history of power, international politics, and the marvelous improvement of airplanes since they first started to fly. It was not until the beginning of the 20th century that nations around the world had to reach an agreement about the air. At the time, Zeppelins were making their first flights. More important perhaps, the airplane not only arrived but quickly became a useful and efficient machine. Perhaps too useful. By the end of the First World War in 1918, planes could dogfight and bomb enemy lines, among other tasks. In 1919, as part of the peace treaty, members from several nations drafted what we now call the Paris Convention in Aviation. The idea behind it was simple. After seeing what airplanes were capable of doing during the war years, nations quickly opted to control airspace in order to control airplanes. From that moment on, it was agreed that each state had complete control of the air above its borders. The situation remained largely this way until 1944, when new ideas about the air appeared. Two things changed at the time. First, it was clear that a new world order was about to emerge with the defeat of the Axis powers. The United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union in particular would become the most important world players. Second, aviation technology had improved exponentially during the war. Airplanes were now able to cross oceans and continents. This would shrink the world and bring dynamics that were entirely new to everybody around the globe. In this scenario, the United States and the British Empire began a debate about who should be able to control the air. On the one hand, the US promoted the idea of a world with freedom of the air. Planes should be able to move freely, fly above any nation, and move passengers and cargo with any other country without asking much permission. Britain, on the other hand, opposed the American view. They wanted to keep legislation similar to that of the 1919 Paris Convention. All nations should have complete control over their airspace. Of course, as you can imagine, there were power agendas behind each position. Britain accused the US of taking advantage of its situation at the end of the war. During the war, the British and the Americans had reached an agreement of airplane production. The British would produce the small dogfighting airplanes, while the Americans would produce long-range bombers. The British argued these bombers could be easily transformed into passenger airplanes, giving the United States a huge advantage in aviation. Likewise, the US economy was strong compared to other European economies by 1944. In this context, Americans would easily control aviation if freedom of the air was the new norm. Meanwhile, the United States accused the British Empire of wanting to take advantage of its vast land possessions to control aviation. With large colonies in Asia and Africa, as well as dominions in Canada and Australia, to mention just a few, Britain could indeed control many key routes around the globe by giving or denying permission to to fly over its territories. Both accusations were fair, and both reflected different visions for the world after the war. In an effort to help solve this problem, the US invited in 1944 all Allied and neutral nations to Chicago to discuss this and other matters related to civil aviation. All nations, with the exception of the Soviet Union, accepted the invitation. The resolutions adopted at the conference have basically molded aviation up until today. Besides reaching key agreements on security and the creation of an international organization, the conference debated the issues surrounding freedom of the air. In the end, all participant nations signed a convention that landed between the American and the British proposals. So, on the one hand, planes could fly over countries that had signed the convention without asking permission. In this way, there was a freedom of the air. But on the other hand, if planes wanted to land and pick up passengers or cargo, they needed to negotiate a specific agreement with that particular nation. Freedom of the air then had its limitations. Today, this is how aviation still works. There is a general freedom to fly over nations, but strict norms regarding landing and commercial rights. So, we can now go back to the question that we posed at the beginning of this video. Who owns the air? Well, now you know the answer. Nations do. However, I wanted this video to do much more than answer this question. This story lets us see the way in which the air and the planes and aviation can teach us about the fascinating world of power and international politics. So, that's all for now. But, in the meantime, never forget that everything has a history behind it, and there is no better way to understand people and ideas and just the world in general than by understanding its history. So, sprinkle a little bit of history in your life.